To be the Evergreen State College.
The Evergreen State,
Washington, yes.
Yeah, back in the day.
Yeah.
And he's been involved in missions in Eastern Europe for a number of years and still is, but he used to live over there. And he is an expert on the environmental movement, which, of course, is a big vehicle that is being used for globalism. And so, Mark, let her rip.
Okay.
Later, Chip.
Thank you. So I know my title is a little bit difficult to get your head wrapped around, but there's three things here that we're going to talk about today. Number one, environmentalism is holistic, and this means it's totalitarian, because by holism we mean totalitarianism. We'll show why that is the case. Number two, environmentalism also promotes lawlessness, because it undercuts the Judeo-Christian values, but also undercuts basic rule of law. It reduces ethics down to the realm of nature. And once nature takes over, there's not much morality left, and we'll talk about how that actually works against us. And then thirdly, the modern environmentalism, also an apocalyptic movement. They're trying to scare everybody into action, and so we see a lot of scaremongering that goes on, whether it's global warming, whatever it may be. It's hyped as an apocalypse, even though they try to deny this and they don't really take it serious. They don't realize that many of their views are actually borrowed from the Bible. And they've misinterpreted it, of course. They've taken it out of context, as we all understand, and applied it to the ecological crisis that exists all around us. What we see in the Bible, however, is, in environmentalism, man is really a part of nature. He's not above nature. God himself, of course, is not above nature. He's a part of nature. They view God as pantheistic. And so when we look at the biblical worldview, this is exactly the opposite of what God demands, what God commands, and what God has given to us in the Scriptures in Genesis 1, 2, and 3 specifically. The divinely ordered creation of the Bible is, number one, God is above men, women, children, animals, and plants. And so we see this, let's look at the chart there. In Genesis, God originally made man in his image, and this makes man above nature. Now, man is obviously a part of nature. He's made from the dust of the earth. We all understand that. But nonetheless, God breathed into him the breath of life. And, of course, on top of that, he's also made in God's image. And so this is something very important, which is being ignored by our modern environmental movement. They don't like this because that means I have a stewardship over the earth. I'm above the earth, and I'm made in God's image. This is something they rebel against. God made the world for man to subdue and fill the earth with population. And, of course, we see this in Genesis chapter 1. God commanded that man subdue and fill the earth. That was his responsibility. And this is something that is commanded by God. It's a divine mandate. It cannot be, people may work against it, but it's still in effect, in other words. Man's original responsibility was to subdue the earth by turning the wilderness into a garden, using Eden as a model. And how are you going to do this? Through the divine institution of marriage being the primary means by which this would be accomplished. So men and women would come together. The woman is the helper to do what? To help subdue and fill the earth. That's what marriage was really designed to do. And by the way, in Genesis, God does not command man to be dominion over people, but over nature specifically. See, all these things are under attack today in our modern society. We don't even stop and think about it, but nature is king today. It's king in America. It's one of the reasons why we see so many problems politically with regard to energy, food prices, whatever it may be. Environmentalism undergirds a lot of problems we see in our modern society. Very similar to what the Old Testament talked about Baalism and how their false nature worship also undermined Israel's their own responsibilities toward God and taking care of the promised land. And we'll take a look at that hopefully later on. The distinction between nature and history was born in Genesis 2 and 3 with matrimony be at the heart of the very issue. Today, of course, marriage is under attack. Homosexual movement, just to name a few things. People are divorced on a large scale today. Not only that, we have people that I heard today statistics where people there's actually more unmarried people in America than married people. So we have a lot of issues to be concerned about, and environmentalism plays into all these weaknesses that we see in our society. Man was never expected to rule over other men, but to rule over nature, not to commune with it. That's another thing. People want to commune with nature. The original divine mandate said no. They were to commune with God and then rule over nature. Not in a, what we call ecologic destructive way, but in the sense of being a steward. And Adam's responsibility, Eve's responsibility originally was to turn the wilderness into a garden. And the Garden of Eden was to be their model. However, they failed. And with the fallen nature also comes sin, death, all kinds of other things. God will now use fallen nature to discipline rebellious man. And so we see this in the opening chapters of Genesis. With the fall of nature comes death, both spiritual and physical. We know this from Genesis 2 and 3, also Romans 5, verses 12 through 14. Interestingly enough, now nature is going to be sacrificed for the sake of man. Interestingly enough, animal sacrifices. The introduction of sacrifice to help people, to help man, his responsibility toward God. And of course, today, we don't want to sacrifice nature. Now we're sacrificing people for nature. It's all exactly the opposite. And we don't stop and think about what's going on all around us, spiritually, even politically, because we haven't really thought it through Genesis 2 and 3. And environmentalism is like a subversive movement. People don't really think where it comes from. It comes from underneath. It comes from the earth, and we'll see later on in the book of Revelation, maybe it might even be the green horseman. We'll talk about some of these things. It's a very serious issue. The sacrifice of nature is introduced as a means of living and or survival. Leviticus, Proverbs 14, verse 4, interesting verse. Yet the very soil man is made of has been cursed by God, so that the ground produces disciplinary thorns and thistles that eventually reaps physical death. So we see this, we experience this all the time. Farmer understands this right away. The dominion mandate is still required of God, but because of sin and death, man cannot properly carry it out. So God still commands man to subdue and fill the earth, but he can't do it. Why? Because he's a fallen creature, plus he's sinful. Yet the mandate still is in effect. It's required. And then when we see people operate this dominion, what happens? All kinds of sin, all kinds of bad things happen. Tyranny usually rules, and environmentalism will play a part, as we will see in the later part of this discussion. Man is now subject to meaningless fallen world of blood, sweat, and tears, as you see in Genesis chapter 3. Marital, domestic conflict as well, and death. This all prevents nature from being subdued. If you have family chaos, you're not going to be able to subdue nature. And of course, we have a lot of family chaos in our world today, especially in America. And so what's happening? Well, we're not able to do much of anything anymore. Build things, whatever it may be, and it's all under environmental attack. All kinds of regulations, all kinds of this and that and the other to prevent sound things from helping us to build. And of course, this is really very subversive in many ways. In Genesis 6 through 8, God uses the great flood, a natural catastrophe, to destroy the extreme evil of Noah's day. So God is always using nature to destroy or to keep man in check. Environmentalism would also be a part of this too, by the way, as a part of the judgment of God. So as we see people move away from God, what happens? Well, other things fill in the vacuum. False doctrines, false ideas. This happened to Israel. And of course, they went to Babylon, they went to Assyria because of their false nature worship, as we will see in the later in our discussion. Interesting, in the book of Romans, nature is a divine revelation of God that judges Gentiles just like the Mosaic Law judges Israel for her sins. This is in Genesis, from Genesis 3, of course, but also Romans chapter 1 talks about this, how man is made in God's image, but he denies this. And what happens? He worships nature rather than God. He doesn't give thanks to God. And in the process of not giving thanks to God, what happens? He gives thanks to nature. He worships nature. Operation idolatry takes over, and then the hardening of the heart also begins. As soon as people, when they don't give thanks to God for what he has created, what happens? There's a hardness of heart that begins to work. That's Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32. So we can talk about how the Word of God also hardens people, but also nature hardens people too, as they don't give glory to God, because nature is created by God. It's a glorious thing that God made, and we should give glory to God for what he has made. But people don't do that. And what happens? Idolatry sneaks in. Nature worship sneaks in, and people don't give proper credit or glory to the one who made all these things. Today, the environmental movement, rooted in pantheistic paganism, is one of the ways in which God uses nature to judge an evil humanity, much like Israel was judged for Baalism and Canaanite nature worship in the Old Testament. The environmental movement is at the heart of our modern culture of death, as it virtually penalizes man for just being alive. It's shocking as we see what's happened to us in the last 30 or 40 years. The environmental movement is in the process of putting the previous capitalistic, Marxist industrial progress of man into checkmate. See, both the capitalists, when we grew up, capitalists and the communists were at, they were at loggerheads. They wanted to see who could progress the most. Is that happening today? No. Exactly the opposite. In fact, we're going to see how Mikhail Gorbachev was trying to bring in the green stuff early, back in the late 1980s. It helped to facilitate the fall of the Soviet Union. We'll talk about this when we get there. It's also connected to existentialism. By that we mean existence trumps divine values. That's what I mean by existentialism. So it has an earthly existential viewpoint. In other words, environmentalism values biology, instincts, willpower over the Judeo-Christian worldview and its ethics. So even death is valued because this helps to, you die and you give growth to plants, you have minerals and stuff to help the nature recreate itself. So that's how they value nature. That's existentialism, and environmentalism is loaded with it. In the book of Revelation, the destruction of nature is also used to judge the great evils of apocalyptic mankind. 2 Peter 3:7, of course, Revelation chapter 6 through 19. One of the interesting features of environmentalism, which I found out quickly when I went to the Evergreen State College, they accuse the Judeo-Christian worldview as being anthropocentric. Now, you and I, we think that we're worshiping God and we should be not anthropocentric. We don't worship ourselves. But environmentalism actually criticizes us for being anthropocentric. Why? Anthropocentrism means man-centered. Medieval scholar and environmentalist Len White Jr. complained in 1967, especially in its Western form, Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion the world has seen. In other words, according to the Greens, Christians are too humanistic. While Christians rightfully criticize the humanistic atheism of men like Karl Marx, Huxley, Dewey, all these guys, Greens criticize Jews and Christians for being too humanistic. This is evidence how radical this movement really is, how dangerous it is. And of course, how militant it also is against these things. They're against humanism of all forms. And by the way, if you look at Marxism closely, you realize how close it is to a lot of Judeo-Christian values in terms of it's a forward-looking view toward the future. It emphasizes humanism in the sense that man needs to subdue and fill the earth. Of course, it's done in a communist way. It's done in a not a good way. I understand all those things. But still, there's a humanism that was working underneath the Soviet communism. There was a humanism in capitalism as well. Where does that come from? It comes from the idea you're made in God's image. Now, these things were distorted. I understand. Without God, you can't understand these things properly. But still, we're being accused of this because man is made in God's image and therefore man has value over nature. So that's what they criticize for being too humanistic. And they blame Christians for this. And Jews as well. The Germans were blaming the Jews for the same stuff back in the 1800s. The dominion mandate was not rescinded by the fall of mankind. We know this because primarily Psalm 8. It was compromised by sin and death, but it still remains in effect. Through sin and death, Satan has dominion over the earth, but only through the agency of man. That's why we see in Isaiah chapter 14, Ezekiel 28, where the king of Tyre and the king of Babylon are like pictures of, they're like representatives of Satan. So it's only through the agency of man, interestingly enough. Why? Because God gave this authority to man. Interesting that even the devil, in spite of his power and in spite of the things that he does, his life has been reduced to the realm of politics. That's one of the reasons why politics is absolute madness, especially today. It's just nuts out there, especially as we look at our own country, what we've seen the last 20, 30 years. Now, we expect it in other places of the world, but in our own country to see this is maddening itself. We have a hard time with it, yet it's what we see. People are saying no to God. There are consequences when you start saying no to God. And environmentalism today is one of them in America. We're not so taken in by the communism, so to speak, but environmentalism is lurking underneath right underneath our toes. And a lot of people are not aware of how powerful this movement is, at least as an undercurrent. Genesis 4 records a quick rise of civilization after Adam and Eve. We see this right away. It doesn't take all this time for man to develop. It happens rapidly. Genesis 4 tells us all about it. After the great flood, Noah was commanded to fill the earth with population. So again, this reinstated. Interesting, animals are now fearful. Probably the beginning of the real wilderness as we understand it today. So now they're running away from man. Genesis 10 and 11 records a quick rise of civilization after the great flood, the culminating in the Tower of Babel. So again, man is going to rapidly rise once again. Why? Because it's made in the structures of creation, and of course God commands it. He's made that way. He's geared that way. Of course it's done in the wrong way because he's sinful, but still, this is part of God's original plan for mankind. He is not to be a brute animal. He's never been that. Joshua's conquest of the Promised Land was the first step toward recovering godly dominion over the earth. Israel's failure in the Mosaic Law pushed off the fulfillment of the Genesis mandate till the coming of Messiah, Psalm 95, Hebrews chapter 4. And only the Messianic kingdom can fulfill the Genesis mandate. Isaiah chapter 11, we know, of course, Andy talked about it earlier, the millennial kingdom. Hebrews chapter 2, verses 5 through 18, very interesting here. Also 1 Corinthians 15. Eden will be replaced with a new Jerusalem, Revelation 21 and 22. So that dominion mandate is going to be fulfilled. That's part of the whole kingdom. That's why the kingdom is coming. God's going to fulfill Genesis chapter 1. He commanded it, and he's not going to allow people to get in the way of it. I mean, people do, of course, and they kind of do their own thing, but he will find a way to get things done, and he will. And that's what the coming kingdom is all about. Interesting enough, this dominion mandate is why the environmentalists get all upset. Environmentalists are smart enough to realize that Christianity actually is what brought to us the scientific revolution. Now, you'll never hear this in school today. You'll never realize that a lot of Christians laid the foundations for our scientific worldview that we have today. You'll never hear this in school, but it's a fact. And here's some quotes. Alfred North Whitehead said, and he died in 47, he said this: "Faith in the possibility of science is an unconscious derivative from medieval theology." Ernst Mach said this: "Every unbiased mind must admit that the age in which the chief development of science, of mechanics, took place was an age of predominant theological cast." Now, why is that? It's because with science, the scientific worldview, they believe that God intelligently designed the universe, and so therefore when I study the universe, when I study nature, I can learn something from it. Why? Because they recognize God intelligently designed it. Now, today we have a huge problem. If nature is not intelligently designed by God and it slowly evolves, how come these scientists are learning so many things from it? This makes no sense. But originally they understood this, and so that's why they studied nature. God made it, and we're going to learn something from this. That was the original view. God made rational laws, and those rational laws govern the universe, and if we understand what God did, we're going to learn many things about God and about people and about His creation. So that's what started science. If you take away that foundation, what's left? Is nature intelligently designed? No. Well, then how can you expect to learn something from it then? These are simple questions that people aren't asking today. It just kind of goes over everybody's head without realizing what they're doing, what they're talking about. Interesting, Erasmus, he was a Catholic Christian humanist. He said, "The ancient Greeks had too much piety to search out with profane curiosity the secrets of nature, to investigate the dimensions, motions, influences of the stars, or even searching for hidden causes of things. This is sacrilege." That's what he said about the Greeks. The Greeks did not invent science. Medieval Catholic and Protestant men, they created the scientific revolution. Greeks, they were contemplators. They liked theories. They liked philosophy. They didn't like science. That's how they viewed things. Plato, interesting. Aristotle's teacher criticized the idea of verification by experimentation. Aristotle separated theory, from practical purposes and saw it as an end in itself, the highest activity of man. To the Greek mind, theoria, or knowledge, emphasized contemplation. Science does not. In science, knowledge is power. You do something with it. This goes back to the book of James, doesn't it? Be a doer of the word. There's power in the word. Right? Yes. Well, let's put this into practice. Let's not just contemplate it. Let's put it into practice. Where does those ideas come from? From the Bible. And of course, it's regularly in the Bible. So they wanted to put these things into practice. And this is why the medieval theologians and some of these other men were involved in the scientific revolution, especially Francis Bacon. He coined the term knowledge is power. And of course, that became the basis for the scientific revolution. This is why Christians are criticized. It's because of people like Francis Bacon. And of course, what did they do? They created mechanics, and we created the Industrial Revolution because of people like Francis Bacon, and we soiled up the planet because of all the things we did, and the Christians are to blame. I mean, I read books on this stuff. I heard this constantly when I went to Evergreen State College. I was shocked when I sat as a young man sitting in these classes, and they're blaming Christians for the ecological destruction of the world because of the Genesis mandate. Yeah. Do you hear this in school today? Well, maybe you're starting to now, because there's enough people that haven't really thought about what's happening here. So again, Francis Bacon, he's an evil man. Al Gore is publicly, he's very upset with Mr. Bacon and what he said. Interesting, medieval natural theology was converted into naturalism. This is part of the problem. See, with science, you study nature, which is part of natural theology, and many of the Catholic theologians love natural theology. Well, they got carried away with natural theology, and what happened? Well, it led to naturalism during the age of deism. And naturalism was born during the age of reason, as the natural laws of nature derived from natural theology were virtually deified under deism, which means all supernatural miracles of divine intervention are now impossible. So now these divine laws, these natural laws, I should say, which they studied, they considered to be inviolable. There's no miracles anymore. So now we go from natural theology to naturalism. And so now God is not a part of much of anything. We don't need Him anymore. And of course, evolution will come out of this whole background as well. Without God, then we have the Enlightenment, of course. Instead of making people happy, which is what they wanted to do, it made people more unhappy. Interestingly enough, it did the opposite of this. Because after the Enlightenment, they tried to make people happy. It didn't happen, so then we get Marxism, we get socialism, anti-capitalism, all these things, environmentalism, all is going to grow up around us because people still aren't happy. Why? Because it's all based on material happiness, material progress. It didn't work. So now they're looking for other answers. How do we get back to what man really is? Of course, environmentalism will be one of the things that they want to do to correct this problem. Christianity and Enlightenment's demystification of nature led to an environmental backlash. So under Protestant worldview, you did not worship nature anymore. And so a lot of people got upset with that because they think, well, if you don't worship nature, therefore I can treat nature with contempt, I can walk all over it, I can create the Industrial Revolution, pollute everything, and be happy about it. So what happened in environmental backlash? Interesting, Immanuel Kant will begin this in Germany, the counter-enlightenment. A lot of people think he's the Enlightenment. He is not. He's a counter-enlightenment. What did he do? He placed limits on reason. Right? Isn't that what he's known for? Now, we can sit there and talk about his philosophy and all that kind of stuff, which I can't do. I'm no expert on him, but I do know one thing. He tried to limit reason. He limited reason too much. I call it sustainable reason. Okay. By the way, we have another man, some of you know him, Thomas Malthus, lived about the same time. He was talking about sustainable development all the way back in the 1700s because there's too many people, not enough resources. So he will talk about how do we live sustainably. There's not enough natural resources. So these ideas were percolating all the way back in the 1700s, and really Kant's going to open up that door, and of course it'll lead to mysticism and also Romanticism. The Industrial Revolution of the mechanistic sciences led to pollution, dirty cities, and to an alienation from the natural world. And then as a backlash to that, the Romantic movement in Germany particularly, although it was in other places too, England and America too, the Romantic movement in Germany remystified nature to bring people back to this non-alienation. Of course, on the other hand, we have communism, socialism too. They tried to mystify politics with the idea of progress, which is a false view of eschatology, believe it or not. Romanticism invaded deism's naturalism, replaced it with existentialism and pantheism. So now naturalism, which we saw a few slides back, connected to deism, now that's going to be replaced with two things: existentialism, which is where existence trumps everything. That's the most important thing. Bare existence, brute instincts, biology, willpower, rather than rational thought. See, Kant started to place limits on reason. So now what's going to take off? Well, now willpower is just as important as reason. Brute instincts or any kind of, that's just as important as reason. It's a part of being a human being. And then those things will actually take over and get rid of reason, or at least set it aside, or put it in check to some extent. And this is all largely discussed in Germany, by the way. Not all of it, but a lot of it. In Romanticism, true empiricism was replaced with existentialism, nature looking into nature. So now man is no longer an outside observer, made in God's image, observing the natural world which God created. Now he's a part of nature, observing nature. So now we have animals observing animals. Does this make sense? No, absolutely none. But it's just what we're doing all the time today. And it undercuts the entire scientific revolution from the very foundations. You can't have science. You have animals looking into nature because animals aren't scientists. But that's what we've devolved into. And do people think about this? Do they stop and think about such simple questions? The answer is no. This just kind of goes right over everybody's head, strangely enough. Amazing what's happened over the last several hundred years. The disconnect between classic empiricism and green science is very real. So now we have the birth of environmentalism, environmental sciences. Nature looking into nature, which undercuts the scientific revolution at its very foundations. So now nature is everything. Today we have Darwinism as a naturalistic foundation and environmentalism as a spiritual ethic, which is often both existential and pantheistic. And of course, pantheism is where God is a part of nature, he's not above it. And a lot of Greens believe in pantheism. And they look at nature, they think they're looking at God, see. And then if you tinker with it, that's bad. Because, nature is God. Gaia, we talked about that earlier, and Andy brought it up. So if you're fooling around with nature, it's like, by the way, you can have sex with anything you want to today. Whatever everything's open, fair game, but if you do anything to nature, She's a virgin, you better not touch her. We're going to put you in jail. I mean, this is the kind of attitude people have today. It's just amazing. What's the turnabout is just shocking. And environmentalism is at the heart of this whole turnabout. Darwin, by the way, borrowed much from German romantic wells of Goethe and Humboldt, so he had a lot of romantic ideas, by the way, in his own, even though he's considered a dismal scientist, he had a lot of romantic ideas in his own worldview. And of course, deistic naturalism led to Lyell's uniformitarianism. Since there were no abrupt miraculous interventions in history or in nature, the constancy of natural laws must explain everything. Scientific natural laws, of course, are going to be slow because the natural laws cannot explain the massive changes that we see in nature. Of course, you have to extend it out millions of years. So they're going to have these natural laws which go on almost for eternity almost. The constancy of natural laws invariably leads to gradual or uniformitarian changes in the natural world. Slow, gradual change according to the nature's laws invariably led to the various doctrines of evolutionism, which, by the way, is in everything. I don't care what subject you study, evolution is at the foundation of everything. Whether it's biology, whether it's geology, culture, religion, history, nature, whatever it may be, psychology, evolution is the total explanation for everything today. Without God, that's all you have to explain what's going on in the world, how people live, and how they function. Darwin, of course, borrowed much from Lyell's geology. Gradual evolution becomes a total answer for everything. Now, this is going to have great consequences with regard to environmentalism. If nature evolves slowly, then all of man's rapid changes in the environment become ominously dangerous. Right? If you accept the evolutionary worldview, and we see all these massive changes, especially in the last 300 years, what are you going to do? You want to put a stop to it. Rather than question evolution, that maybe evolution isn't true. If the Industrial Revolution just shattered evolution, the whole doctrine of it within 300 years, maybe this doctrine's not true. Does anybody think about that? No. So what are they going to do? They're going to double down on people and industry, capitalism, to put a stop to it, rather than consider that maybe their doctrine is not true. It's amazing the things that are happening all around us without us really digging into it. Man upsets the evolutionary balance of nature that allows organisms to adjust slowly to change. Under Christianity and the Enlightenment, modern man evolved and progressed too quickly. This progressive evolution is unsustainable for the planet's environment. Notice all these criticisms. Lynn White, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. He wrote this for a science journal in 1967. He said, the medieval monk was an intellectual ancestor of the scientist. Do you hear that in our schools today? No. Before the 11th century, science scarcely existed in the Latin West, even in Roman times. From the 11th century, the scientific sector of the Occidental or Western Christian culture has increased in a steady crescendo. By the end of the 15th century, the technological superiority of Europe was such that its small, mutually hostile nations could spill out over the rest of the world, conquering, looting, and colonizing. The symbol of this technological superiority is the fact that Portugal, one of the weakest states of the Occident, Christian West, was able to become and to remain for a century mistress of the East Indies. So Portugal becomes a world power thanks to the scientific revolution. Rather than question evolution, of course, they're not going to do that. They're going to come after the scientific revolution, interesting enough, and yet they're still going to talk about how scientific they are, even though they've undermined the very foundations of it all. And then you and I are the bad guys and the stupid people. We're not scientists and we don't know what we're talking about. I mean, this is just shocking, all the things that have happened over the last several centuries. Christianity, in absolute contrast to ancient paganism and Asia's religions, not only established a dualism of man and nature, but also insisted that it's God's will that man exploit nature for his proper ends. By destroying pagan animism, Christianity made it possible to exploit nature in a mood of indifference to the feelings of natural objects. So this diatribe just goes on and on. We could talk about this guy for a long time. Nature cannot therefore survive Christianity, anthropocentrism, or capitalistic industry, or injury. We could say that too. Too much CO2. Notice the balance of nature. It's bad. Do they consider that there's a such thing as a fallen world? No. Maybe the fallen world is the problem. Maybe sin is a problem. They don't think about those things because everything is considered from a naturalistic viewpoint or even from a romantic viewpoint, where they don't believe in a fallen world. So here the environmentalists, this is what they look at. So we saw the Enlightenment, how they viewed the world. Now here's the environmentalists. I mean, it's just all bad news. Here's their description of the fallen world right here. It's all diagrammed out for you. They're studying it to their heart's content, and they're going to blame you for it at the same time for just being a person, because you created all these natural problems. Soil degradation, desertification, food crisis, natural disasters, rising sea levels, air pollution, acid deposition, emission, the accumulation of chemicals, whatever it may be. I mean, it's all here. Are some of these problems? Of course, I understand. But of course, like Andy said earlier too, these things are exaggerated. They're overblown. They're turned into apocalyptic crisis, so that we have to do something about the problem. Then they're going to be willing to spend all your money in order to fix a problem. And of course, these are not as big a problems. This is part. It comes to the fallen world. You're not going to fix the fallen world, folks. Environmentalism is the answer to man's recent meteoric trajectory over the natural world. That's what they think. Environmentalism has a healthy and holistic worldview. Environmentalism values giving rights to ecosystems in order to protect them. Environmental holism and ethics will save the planet from man's apocalyptic destruction of it. That's how they view what's going on. They're going to save it. So now we have a salvation equation also being put into the equation with regard to what's going on. The environmentalists are going to save the world. So another salvific operation. They're copying God, just like, Satan counterfeits everything that God does. Now he's going to save the world. We used to save people, didn't we? Now we're going to save the world. Environmental holism subverts God's divinely created order. Environment is king rather than God. Notice environment is number one, society is number two, economy is number three. If you are wondered about why the debt's so bad and why your pocket is not as full as it used to be, I think that diagram will explain it for you. What's more important? By the way, money is not all important, is it? So they use such things. We're not just materialistic beings. And environmentalists will use such things to get to people's conscience, make them feel guilty. Now, we Christians have other answers to those kind of problems, but they don't look at those answers. But that's how they're going to view it. And so environment becomes king, society number two, economy, and then you're someplace else. Notice self is at the very bottom. In holism, the environment becomes king over man and even over God of the Bible. Under the authority of environmental holism, man is not permitted to rise above the circle of life. There is no apocalypse, even though they warn about apocalypse every day. It's interesting. But the reason why they do, they're trying to avoid the apocalypse, which is mankind totally uncontrolled. They want to get people back under the circle of life, see, where things are nice and pleasant, romantic, and things are good. See, that's what they want. Environmental holism is a form of collectivism that goes beyond humanism, socialism, and communism because it includes nature as well. So it's about as collective as you could make it. Now, nature, the flowers and the grass, that's your brothers and sisters, the mountains. Now you're going to share your life with them. And you got to pay them too, see. There's a lot of mountains of cash going to those mountains, see. It's amazing. Environmental holism is a totalitarian worldview that emphasizes mutual interdependence. That's the whole point. They want to use, the natural world as your brothers and sisters. You can't go against their rights to live or whatever it may be. You can't upset what they do. Holism comes from the Greek word allos, which means whole, all, entire, or total. Hence totalitarian. Holism is the idea that all the properties of a given system, whether physical, biological, chemical, social, economic, mental, whatever it may be, cannot be determined or explained by its component parts. Holism asserts a system as a whole determines in an important way how the parts behave. And so holism really is at the heart of the environmental movement. It also prevents you from being made in God's image and to act like it, which is the whole point. They want to make everything so mutually interdependent that you cannot act like a being made in God's image. Modern environmentalism is also a form of fascism. Believe it or not, holism, and basically fascism, what does it mean? It means holism. You haven't heard that either. But that's what it means. It's an attempt to undercut the Judeo-Christian dualism that separates man from nature. They want to put everything under a fascist, totalitarian control. Interdependent. The father of German social Darwinism, Ernst Haeckel, coined the term ecology in 1866. That should tell you something. Same guy. Father of both. Social Darwinism was originally called monism. That's what they used to call it, which means one. Later on, of course, we call it fascism, we call it whatever we want to. All kinds of names have been slapped all over the place. But still, social Darwinism was originally called monism by Ernst Haeckel and his followers. German monism, or social Darwinism, was a romantic, pantheistic, holistic view of man and nature that attempted to explain everything within the context of nature alone, including the evolutionary distinctions of the different races. That's what they're trying to do. How do we explain race? How do we explain the differences between people? Especially in the West, especially in the Christian West, which produced the scientific revolution. Where do all these changes come from? Rather than think that blessings come from God, they had to explain them scientifically from a naturalistic viewpoint. So what did they do? Well, they confused that with racism. And then, of course, all kinds of things are happening now. And now we have science involved with biology and evolution and racism. Something you don't hear about either today. That's what all the scientists were involved in racism between 1850 up until World War II. Then there's a massive repentance on the subject. Now it's never even talked about. But they were trying to justify racism. All these things. Unbelievable. Protestant blessing in the West was replaced with the evolutionary racism as a scientific explanation. Ernst Haeckel's biological and or ecological monism laid the groundwork for National Socialism and modern environmentalism. Haeckel deeply criticized the anthropocentrism of Christianity. Racist environmental fascism of yesterday has been now replaced with deep ecological anti-humanism. So now we're no longer racist, but now they're against people in general. Wonderful. By the way, the same people that used to emphasize eugenics back from 1800 or 1900 to 1950, after World War II, they started talking about overpopulation. It's the same people. And then we have our own Aldo Leopold, father of deep ecology. He visited, interestingly enough, Nazi Germany in 1935. Thought it was what they were doing was pretty good. He criticized a few things, but thought for the most part these guys are doing a good job. While sitting in his hotel room in Berlin, Leopold wrote about the need for interdisciplinary thinking when it came to ecology, the idea of fascism, again, holism. We want to integrate our thoughts. Leopold wanted to do away with the fragmentation of knowledge fostered by Western thought that had artificially separated history and economic studies and the social sciences from ecology, from nature. Leopold looked forward to the day when these course disciplines could be fused together, which is, again, a fascist view of education. Leopold praised the new green direction Nazi Germany was then implementing at the time, and his famous Sand County Almanac, which is an environmental book, written in 1947, notice what he criticized Americans for adopting: their Abrahamic concept of the land, which goes back to the Genesis mandate. And of course also the promised land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Where did he get that idea? I assume he got it from Germany. The Abrahamic concept of the land, the Jewish concept of the land. So he's the father of deep ecology. And if you want to, what is deep ecology? We'll look at that picture there. That person's head looks like a tree. By the way, a person that looks like that can't think proper. Okay, that's a perfect view of existentialism. And you got people like this thinking like that all the time. They're in our education department. What are they going to be teaching kids? This is existentialism. It's a real problem. And these things that trump rational thought, any kind of reason. Kant, of course, wants sustainable reason. Well, is this the answer? No, it's not. It's pretty bad. Up until the early 1930s, Leopold was a classic conservationist like Gifford Pinchot, Teddy Roosevelt. That would be more like what most people view environmentalism, like Teddy Roosevelt. Conservationism, which is something that I would value. But now deep ecology has replaced that, which a lot of people don't know. And deep ecology is against any kind of stewardship of the land. Nature is now he's on this a par with you, no different. He's just as good as you, if not better. Nature does not exist to serve humans. And if we were to look at this chart here, all the different views of what we would call environmentalism, notice sustainable development debate right in the middle of that whole discussion. That's where all the money is. You have different radical groups, deep ecology, way out there in the far periphery, other different, ecofeminism, eco-socialism, social ecology, anti-capitalism, but then there's no money out there. Right? So what do? All the debate is over sustainable development in the middle. That's where all the money is, because industry and people have to live. You can't avoid this. It's a part of the Genesis mandate again. You can't avoid living. But yet, when we compromise with such folks, what happens? We have a sustainable development discussion. And there's a lot of interesting things we could draw out from this chart. But regardless, this is a lot of things are happening. The environmental movement is not monolithic. There's a lot of different aspects to it, a lot of different facets to it, a lot of different viewpoints on it. After World War II, environmentalism became a global movement. Aldo Leopold's deep ecology has increasingly replaced the classic Roosevelt-Pinchot conservationism rooted in Judeo-Christian tradition, where we are stewards of God's green earth. That's no longer viewed as positive. Interesting, Austrian Nazi Gunther Schwab's Dance to the Devil, 1958, wrote a book, prefaced the entire environmental litany of the modern age, including global warming. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring ignited North American environmentalism in the 1960s. Charles Lindbergh, he was criticized for being a fascist, pro-German in his day, played a critical role in developing the fledgling environmental movement into a global network in the late 1960s. The super elitist environmental think tank Club of Rome was established in 1968, establishing Malthusian math. Of course, they want to be in charge of the resources of the world, and of course, they're going to exasperate the problem. It's already, we live in a fallen world as it is, and these guys are going to make it worse. And of course, they're very rich, and they want to use it to control people. The peak oil theory was heavily promoted during the 1960s and 70s, which fracking and gasified coal, by the way, has since shown to be a false doctrine. But it was promoted for many years. Interesting, throughout the 1970s, former Austrian Nazi Kurt Waldheim developed the United Nations Environmental Program into an influential worldwide movement as the UN Secretary General. 1970s, he was all involved with this. Kurt Waldheim. Later, they found out in the 1980s he was a Nazi. So he was there, he developed it in the 1970s in particular. The German Green Party was essentially founded by former Nazis in 1979. You don't hear that, but that's it. They had to clean them out. It took them a while. 1986, the German Geophysical Society began the global warming crusade. 1987, something you should be aware of as well. The EPA began cleaning up non-point source pollution as opposed to direct discharge point source pollution. What does that mean? Well, now they're going after everything that, potentially everything in your property is under suspicion because it's non-point. They used to go after point source discharge, see. Where is that, actual pollution. Now they're talking about non-point source pollution, which means it can be created by runoff. You get a little pollution, hit something, it kind of spreads, goes to different areas. Your roof, the water runs off your roof, it goes down a gutter, and mixes with some of the stuff you may have around the house, and that washes into the watershed. Well, we got to regulate that too. That started in 1987. It's a huge thing. That's basically, it comes after your land. 1988, the IPCC was set up by the UN to stabilize dangerous anthropogenic greenhouse gases interfering with the climate. And now the Sustainable Development Agenda has seemingly replaced communism and the older socialism in Europe since the early 1990s. This is now the new wrecking ball for capitalism we see in the West. The Club of Rome, well, who are these guys? Well, it is the most powerful environmental think tank in the world. Interesting, the Club of Rome. Didn't Daniel predict the rise of the revived Roman Empire? Club of Rome, interestingly enough. Comprised of major political leaders, UN bureaucrats, green leaders, economists, scientists from all over the globe. It published in 1972 Limits to Growth. So now we talked about limits to reason, right? Limits to natural resources, now it's limits to growth. I mean, they're all talking about limits. Every time these people talk, it's about limits. What did God tell people to do? Spread, fill the earth, repopulate it. Exactly the opposite. They're always talking about limits. And then we're the bad guys, right? And we're about limiting everything. Well, I'm not going to tell you to turn off the lights, for example. That's not a sin, in my opinion. Or not driving your car. That's not a sin. But they think that. They're actually the ones who are limiting all kinds of things for the foolish, for foolish reasons. And yet they're full of self-importance. It is extremely well funded by major financiers, banks, and important financial groups. Notice what it said. The Club of Rome has stated the earth has a cancer. The cancer is man. That's nice. What are they going to do about that problem? State of the world, Club of Rome. Everything's getting worse. And of course, it's all based on Malthusian math. The idea that there's too many people, not enough resources. That's Malthusian math. And this is really at the heart of environmentalism. It was at the heart of Adolf Hitler's campaign when he went to take over more land to his east. Too many people, not enough resources. Environmentalism today, of course, the peak oil theory, all these things are rooted in Malthusian math. And the Club of Rome, they call it the problem of the world, they call it the problematique, whatever that means. Rising oil prices, again, it's all wrapped around, like peak oil theory, that type of stuff. Not enough natural resources, too much, USA is too strong, and of course they hate global capitalism, even though that really is supposed to stand for free markets. But that's not how they, anyway, all kinds of things going on there. We could talk about it a lot, but we won't. Interesting, in the 1970s, the Club of Rome wanted to divide the planet into 10 bioregions. That's what they wanted to do. The Club of Rome. Of course, America is back then number one. They probably would change that. Maybe put Europe number one today. I don't know. Now we have sustainable development. And what sustainable development requires is really self-sufficiency to stop the nightmare of global capitalism, which is really an old Nazi doctrine. That's what they wanted to do. They called it autarky, which means self-sufficiency. You do everything, grow your own food, do everything yourself, and no international globalism run by Jews. I mean, that's how the Nazis looked at it. Now it's global capitalist. Same type of arguments. Now it's not against the Jews, it's just against global capitalism in general. Bioregionalism is an area that shares similar human culture, topography, plant, and animal life. In bioregionalism, racism has been replaced with the indigenous principle. Think about that. Okay, we're still involved in racism. They don't call it. Now it's all preoccupied with the indigenous principle. So Adolf Hitler ruined the whole racist arguments, but they're still all excited about indigenous peoples. Tribalism. So tribalism, self-sufficiency, this is at the heart of what we call sustainable development. Nazi Germany was the first country to put into practice what we would call sustainable development. And now it's virtually everywhere. Below the waterline of sustainability iceberg, what you see all looks good on the surface, but underneath all kinds of stuff is not good. And people need to pay more attention to all the things that are doing underneath that's not seen. Again, environmentalism is very subversive, and it fools many people. Agenda 21, we could talk about that. That's all, a lot of debates there. Of course, what they're trying to do, they want to go from United Nations down to your local level, bypass your constitution of your country, and they're going to set up their green plans for your local community, and they'll help you do it. Agenda 21. Agenda 21 is designed to make the entire world more sustainable. It wants to place people to cities to help facilitate the rewilding of the earth and increase its biodiversity for the overall health of the planet. So let's get people into town. Put them into the ghetto. Modern style. Yet, Agenda 21 is a non-binding voluntary agreement, so it's not as ominous. I mean, this can be fought back. It is being fought back today in many places, and it is possible to push back. So it is considered a voluntary non-binding agreement, but they still want to accomplish these things, and there's many places that it's already been accomplished. A lot of green things going on in your local community. The Circle of Life in Agenda 21. They love this stuff. It's all about politics. Maurice Strong, Canadian oil tycoon, Club of Rome member. He was the Secretary General of the United Nations Environmental Program in the 1970s, working under Kurt Waldheim. He's a big oil person, by the way. He excused himself from the UN after he was found to be involved in the UN Iraqi oil for food scandal. He's the guy that had to step down. Look, these guys are involved with natural resources. They want to control them. And he was involved in Iraq. As an environmental elitist, Strong wants to curtail what he calls the excesses of the middle class. Say, you guys are the problem. Not him, of course. He's above all that. Current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class involving high meat intake, use of fossil fuels, appliances, home and workplace air conditioning, suburban housing are not sustainable. A shift is necessary which will require a vast strengthening of the multilateral system, including the United Nations. You guys are out of control. He's not, of course. He once stated, "Isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilization collapse?" Isn't it our duty to bring that about? Rich guy. Gorbachev. He's involved with the Green Cross International today. He used to be a Soviet atheist. Now he says nature is my God. There's been a repentance from Soviet communism to environmentalism. You know, the Soviet Union they had all kinds of ecological disasters in the 1970s and 80s, not just Chernobyl. And so, interestingly enough, I read through a lot of his speeches. His idea of the perestroika was to open up the Soviet Union to environmentalism, which I didn't know. I found it very surprising, shocking. And he was already deindustrializing the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, and I can rest assure you that helped to facilitate the fall of the Soviet Union quicker, made it worse. Environmentalism. Because they were polluting all kinds of things. They had all kinds of plans. In fact, some of these scientists, it's like the Soviet man, they worship man, okay, which is bad. And they thought that man was so great that they were going to they had a plan in the Soviet Union to push all the rivers that were heading north. They're going to make them all go south. And Gorbachev put a stop to that for environmental reasons. And of course, that the Caspian Sea, it's basically gone because of the things they were trying to do, let alone Chernobyl. Chelyabinsk was another nuclear explosion. So this is why he takes on the green cloak rather than question the Soviet Union and all of the goofy things they had going on there, the Stalinism and the worship of man. Rather than think about that, he's going to go in a different direction now, which is just go from one mud puddle to the next. It's like kind of like a leapfrog. They don't think about God in this whole equation. Now nature is his God. Pantheism means that God is everything. Of course, he says nature is my God and God is everything. Man is strictly a part of nature, not above it. Neither is the God of the Bible. It can't be above it. Pantheism intensifies holistic environmental totalitarianism, makes it worse. Makes it a religious issue. Then we have Dr. James Lovelock and the Gaia hypothesis. Notice what he says here in the middle here. In the Ages of Gaia, Lovelock wrote, "Unless organisms occupy their planet extensively and involve with it as a single system, the conditions of their tendency is not met." So what's he want to do? He wants to place controls on people for upsetting that balance of Gaia. Keep on reading. The evolution of species and the evolution of their environment are tightly coupled together as a single and inseparable process. And then Gaia theory is as out of tune with the broader humanist world as it is with the established science. In Gaia, we are just another species, neither its owners nor stewards of this planet. Our future depends much more upon the right relationship with Gaia than with the never-ending drama of interest. And of course, by that he means human interest. They're anti-people. They don't like people. They think people is the problem. That's partially true. But the problem is with sin, not with people. And of course, Gaia was one of the original gods of the Greek gods, their family tree. Notice it's at the very top. The earth, that's Gaia. And if you look at you study the Greek gods, they become more impersonal the higher you go. They become more personal the lower you go. And Gaia is at the very top. Notice Eros is right next to Gaia. Wow. Tyranny, nature worship are common biblical themes. We see it in the Tower of Babel especially, but also throughout Israel's history. The house of slavery in Egypt, what were they worshiping? Nature, the sun gods. Pharaoh. Baal was a storm of fertility god back in 1 Kings chapter 16. And of course, Ahab and Jezebel, they were the kings, a very oppressive time. And of course, there was global warming back then too, wasn't there? Remember, there was no rain for 3 years. 3.5 years, wasn't that what it was? Eco-tyranny was going on. Baal worship, you had to worship Baal. What were people doing? Worshipping trees, mountains. They worshipped underneath the oak trees, different places, on top of the hills. They'd have their picnics, have whatever their sexual things they were doing. Then they were involved with sacrificing babies, too. Nature worship, tyranny was immoral, subversive, and idolatrous. Baalism provided nature worship, asceticism, raving, together with perverse sexuality and cult prostitution. On the one hand, you have this total abandon with regard to sexual practices. On the other hand, they restricted all kinds of other things, which is what the environmental movement does today, too. Thanks to Jezebel's Baalistic despotic influences, Ahab stole Naboth's vineyard from him and had him murdered. Private property was stolen for the sake of Baalism, for the sake of tyranny. Isaiah speaks of Israel's lack of spiritual leadership while the nation worshipped trees, mountains, and offered child sacrifices to Baal. Jeremiah compares Israel's nature worship to adultery and her idols of stones and rocks to sexual toys. You can read that in Jeremiah chapter 2 and 3. Jeremiah compares Baalism with brute instinctive behavior which ruined Judah, and of course both the Babylonian and Roman Empire were tyrannical and very immoral. In modern environmental ethics, basically there is no ethics. And everything environmentalism does, it undermines the ethics of Judeo-Christian values. Whether it be God being the owner of the universe, or you have your private property, or the things connected to economy, respect for other people, whatever it may be, they undermine that entire process. The Mosaic Law was undermined by Baalism. Today, environmental ethics undermines God's Judeo-Christian values today as well. Notice here a little picture of what we're talking about. That's wrong, of course, on the far, the wrong red there. Man is on top. But that which is right, man is lost in the middle of nature. Just a part of it. This is taught to our kids all the time now in public schools. Normal. We can see it this way as well. Whatever any way you want to. Man is the center. No, he's just a part of everything. This is holism. Ecocentrism. So ethics have been redefined. And there's another good chart. Modern Greens believe anthropocentrism has led to the immoral destruction of nature. So you're made in God's image, you're selfish, ego. You're on top of the world. But in eco, everything, you're just a part of it, and you're nice to nature. We are one. And then, of course, environmentalism is full of legalism, full of all kinds of laws, rules and regulations galore. Earth Charter in particular has all kinds of ideas that they want to implement worldwide. And what does legalism do? What does the New Testament tell us? It leads to lawlessness. Right? I mean, Eve, what did she do? Remember? She took hold of the fruit. Of course, God told Adam, don't eat from the tree. What did Eve do? She said, don't touch it. She added to it. Did that stop her from eating it? No. Legalism does not stop sin. And so all this environmentalism that they're doing is not going to do much of anything. And by the way, they have an Ark of Hope. It's a religious symbol of environmental legalism today. It's a replica of the Ark of the Covenant. It contains the Earth Charter document inside of it. And all kinds of funny things going on there. They call it the Ark of Hope. And this is paraded in different places throughout the world. Environmental legalism is a deceitful form of lawlessness. Think about all the people that die of DDT, die of malaria because they can't treat mosquitoes with DDT. Millions die every year in Africa. The Greens forbid it. There's too many people, not enough resources, so let's just let Africa die off. Wow. Ethanol mandates have made both corn and gas more expensive worldwide. Corn is a primary staple of the poor in many third world countries. Renewable energy is dirtier than natural gas and oil. You're not told that, but it is. Corn especially. Formaldehyde's worse than just regular CO2. Windmills are loaded with oil and are gigantic bird and bat killers. There's a big solar panel complex in Death Valley. It vaporizes a large number of insects and birds. They fly over this area in Death Valley and they just vaporize. And so it leads to, actually it's worse. A lot of things are doing actually worse today than the environment than what they're telling you, of course. Arthur Schopenhauer is the father of modern environmental ethics and a guru of animal rights. He blamed the Jews in Genesis for giving to Europe the utilitarian perspective of nature. And by the way, that was Hitler's favorite philosophy. And the Nazis had many pro-animal, anti-people, anti-Jew in particular policies that they made as a part of their socialist plans. Today, environmental prophets and their godless morality. Dr. Peter Singer, professor of bioethics at Princeton, said, Christianity is our foe. If animal rights is to succeed, we must destroy the Judeo-Christian religious tradition. David Graeber, National Park Service biologist, said human happiness and certainly human fecundity is not as important as wild and healthy planets. Some of us can only hope for the right virus to come along. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Charles's dad. If I could be reincarnated, I would return as a killer virus to lower human population levels. Prince Charles, the best of all mosques is nature herself. Ted Turner, global visionary. A total population of 250 to 300 million people at 95% decline from present levels would be ideal. And of course, environmentalism is a profane apocalyptic movement. You know, they secularize apocalypticism. So now instead of worried about the judgment of God, they're worried about global warming. Okay, that's just a good example. Greens have many other apocalyptic concerns beyond global warming, of course. There's just many of them. It's not just that. Once global warming falls, they'll find another one. So now the question is, how green is the apocalypse? It's a good question. It's a difficult one. Interesting. The fourth horseman of the apocalypse is actually green or pale green. Did you know that? Revelation chapter 6. The adjective chloros is used to describe the fourth horseman, which is primary Greek word for green or pale green. Chloros is clearly translated as green in Revelation and also the book of Mark. So Mark 6:39, when Jesus told the disciples and to sit down in the green grass, the word used is chloros. William Tyndale translated the fourth horseman as the green horse. And the Greek LXX, the Greek Septuagint, often translate chloros from the Hebrew to mean color green or greenery, maybe greenness, relative to plants, usually. Chloros also stands for the greenery of the field and Numbers, and also green plant, and other, different places, Genesis, for example. Psalm 37:2, it literally means the vegetables of the green, or perhaps, garden variety greens, in other words. And when chloros is used as a negative particle, it is translated as dry or withered in the sense of no green thing. So it can be without moisture as well, for example, or something fresh. It is also where we get our idea of chlorophyll. That comes from this word too, chloros, which is clear. So this is why some people have taken this to be pale. Homer uses chloros to mean pale relative to the face because of fear in the Iliad, which is why commentators have translated it pale in Revelation 6:8. That'd be the only place in the Bible we would take it as pale. Revelation 6:8. We can debate that, whatever it may be. Probably pale green would be the best way to characterize the green horse in Revelation 6:8. Why don't we read that passage? Open up your Bibles, Revelation 6:8. I looked, and behold, it says here, a pale green horse, and he who sat on it had the name of Death, and Hades was with him, following with him. Authority was given to him over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword, with famine, and with pestilence, and by the wild beast of the earth. So there we have the wild beast mentioned. Of course, we're going to save enough animals to have them be a danger in the Great Tribulation. Of course, they'll probably take away your guns. You can't protect yourself. And of course, once this planet starts to shake, all the technology is going to fall by the wayside anyway, because you can't have, all these things are going to be, it's going to be a total disaster. What are you going to do? We're going to be put back to the Stone Age very quickly. How are you going to protect yourself? The rider is named Death and Hades. It follows with the rider, the only horseman with the name, Revelation 6:8. The rider is given a mandate to have authority over a quarter of the earth. He is the only horseman given a specified amount of totalitarian power to kill mankind in 4 different ways. He will kill with a sword, with famine, with pestilence, and with predators. The other horsemen are limited to 3 different forms of judgment combined. The white horse, conquest; red horse, war; the black horse, inflation or food prices. I mean, all these things are bad, but it's kind of interesting. We have the 4th horseman, and he is the only one with a name. He's kind of distinguished from the others for whatever reason. Is there a relationship between the Old Testament Baalism and the green horseman of the apocalypse? As Israel approached the promised land, interesting, Moab spoke to leaders of Midian, this horde will lick up all that is around us as the ox licks up the greeneries. There's our word chloros of the field. He's worried about sustainability. King Balak. King Balak of Moab then sent to Balaam, prophet of Midian, to curse Israel for him because, notice, they cover the surface of the land and they are living opposite me. So he's worried about too many people, too many Jews in particular. Balaam was forbidden to curse Israel since they were blessed. But wanting to be paid by King Balak, he devised an adulterous scheme by introducing Baalism into Israel's camp, since Balak and Moab were Baal worshippers. And of course now Baalism now is going to really hurt Israel now for the next several centuries. That all begins all the way back during the Exodus generation, or following, right as soon as they're going to enter the Promised Land. Jeremiah 32 associates Baalism with the destruction of Judah by the hands of the Babylonians. Ezekiel predicts the Babylonian captivity because of Judah's idolatrous nature of worship. And of course, if we look at the Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7, Daniel 2 we're all familiar with. There we have the worship of man, Nebuchadnezzar, but we ignore chapter 7. Here we have the wild animals. It's the same. It's the same dream. The same countries are mentioned, but now they're characterized as wild animals. So we have human worship, nature worship. How does this work? Well, there's no way you can deny that man is the best on the planet. And so if you worship nature, invariably you will worship man. If you don't believe in God, that's how it works. So on the one hand, we may have progress of man. We worship man because of his progress. On the other hand, we worship nature. And these are contradictory ideas, but look at when people ignore God, that's exactly what happens. They come up with contradictory ideas. They are also very destructive, self-destructive. Nebuchadnezzar spent 7 years as a mindless brute for his pride. Lost his mind. Right? 7 years. He became increasingly prideful of his Babylonian sovereignty that God gave him. Nebuchadnezzar's tree dream warned him of this pride. We know from Daniel 4. Nebuchadnezzar ignored the warnings, and God took away his sanity for 7 years. Just something to think about. Is it possible Nebuchadnezzar's time with the beasts is a historical time for the 7-year Great Tribulation that will be run by the beastly Antichrist? People are going to lose their minds during the Great Tribulation. God is, he's judging them, and they're going to become more hard against God as time goes on. We see it especially in Revelation chapter 16. The earth dwellers. They will hide themselves in the caves and call out for the mountains to protect them from God's wrath. Interesting, Revelation 6:15 and 17 quotes from the book of Hosea that graphically depicts the nature worship of Baalism. That's where they call out for the mountains to come down on top of them to protect them from the wrath of God. Is it possible the anti-reason, romantic, and existentialist movements that undergird modern environmentalism will help facilitate or lay the groundwork for the future beastly madness of the apocalypse? And then after the Great Tribulation is over, the surviving Gentile powers will receive their sanity back and worship the Lord during the millennium and the new heavens and new earth, at least those who survive. The beastly, mindless character of the apocalypse will also be a time of great lawlessness, we know as well, for many passages. All that are going to break asunder all of God's laws, all of his fetters, what they call his fetters, all of his restrictions. Hosea relates Baalism with Hades and Revelation's earth dwellers. Being married to the prostitute Gomer, interesting, Hosea compares Israel's Baalism to a drunken whorehouse of death throughout the entire book. Hosea 13 prophesies that Israel's Baalism will not protect them from the hand of Sheol, which is translated as the hand of Hades in 13:14. By the way, wild beasts are also mentioned, verses 7 and 8. God's going to sick wild animals on Israel to discipline them. Is the hand of Hades the hand of the fourth horseman of the apocalypse? Good question. Very often, hand means authority or power in the Bible. Revelation 6:15 and 16 loosely quotes from Isaiah 10:8, where the earth dwellers call out to the mountains to fall upon them to protect them from God's wrath at the breaking of the sixth seal, right after the fourth horseman begins his ride. In Hosea 10, Hosea prophesies that God will destroy Israel's idolatrous nature worship by using their protector, the Assyrian king, as the very instrument of her judgment. Notice the quotation, Hosea 10:8. Also, the high places of Avon, the sin of Israel, will be destroyed. Thorn and thistle will grow on their altars. Then they will say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills fall on us. Notice those solar panels are full of weeds. Taken over. That's in Germany, by the way. Picture in Germany. The idolatrous mountain worship and spiritual adultery in Hosea seems to be related to the harlot of Revelation 17, under whose dominion God's people will be sacrificed. Revelation 17:1 through 9. The harlot sits on many waters and rides a scarlet beast in the wilderness and is inspired by ancient Babylonian idol and nature worship. Revelation 17 and also chapter 9, verses 20 and 21. So that concludes my discussion about environmentalism, its totalitarian impulses, its lawlessness, and also its apocalyptic mindset. And any questions you may have, I can try to answer them. And I'd recommend a very good book to you, by the way, too, up there. National Socialism and the Green Movement. It's a very interesting discussion, fascinating discussion.
Well, golly, Sergeant Carter, I didn't know there was so much stuff on this out there.
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, this is amazing, isn't it? How all of this stuff has come into our culture and society, and hardly any of us know about it, right? You can imagine what it's going to be like during the trib. Any questions or comments? Go ahead.
Just a couple of comments. First of all, I've been accused of being anthropocentric or whatever it is, but they're the most narcissistic, self-centered persons that are attacking me, accusing me of being anthropocentric. But also, Proverbs 8:36 says, "Those who hate me love death," and I think you made that clear in this presentation today, that the logical conclusion of this humanist thinking is death.
I would say it's worse than humanism. I mean, humanism, at least you're helping people to some extent. Environmentalism is anti-people and really leads to their death and destruction very quickly, much faster. Yeah.
Use of the word nature is probably not appropriate for your talk, because to the world that implies no God exists. It implies this is natural, something that came without God. To refer to the creation, okay, as nature is, in my view, error. So I would suggest talking about creation rather than nature.
Well, yeah, I understand there's a lot of issues there. For lack of a better word, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
I think
to be more specific, you could talk about creation, but nature is so widely used by environmentalism today that it's part of our...
But they know what it... They have that meaning to it.
They define it exactly as you say, yes. Yeah, of course, yes. Exactly.
One of the questions that strikes me is that in order to have a great population reduction, you have to have a reason to reduce the population. Do you think this kind of environmentalism provides the ethic that undergirds what appears to me to be a coming worldwide population reduction by the forces of the elite?
Of course, there's no question in my mind. They just don't have the power to do it right now. I think there are some people that would love to do this, but they just don't have the power to do it. Well, it could be. That could very well be. We'll see. But they want to use environment. There's no really ethics environmentalism, because nature is really what teaches you, gives you the ethics. In nature, you have survival of the fittest. That's really all that nature teaches you. I mean, according to them. Now, I believe in God created nature. You can learn a lot of things from nature that are consistent with God's standards, but they don't believe in God, so they'll never come up with those kinds of conclusions. They'll come up with the opposite. And survival of the fittest is at the heart of evolutionary doctrine. And so once Judeo-Christian values are set aside, what's left? I mean, it's...
last time you spoke, you put a map up on Agenda 21 about how they plan on depopulating half of America or something.
Well, they want to put them into cities.
Yeah.
They put everybody into cities, and then out in the countryside, everything will be green and pretty. And they will put you in the ghetto, which is where you belong. So.
Right. And this is why people like Ted Turner are buying up large plots of land.
Exactly, yes.
In order to depopulate that.
We have a small farm in Olympia, Washington. We could easily sell our farm to the conservation group, and they'll just turn it back to nature, and that'll be it.
Right.
And every time you do that, all the prices of food, whatever it may be, it goes up, because you can't have 300 million people live in the jungle. It can't be done. And of course, there's a partial truth in what they're saying about too many people in terms of that. But the people made in God's image, they can figure out a way to make this work. And of course, God made the universe, and so therefore we can trust God that He's given us enough natural resources to deal with the population that we do have. But they don't believe that. So it places them in all kinds of contradictory ideas that they're going to implement in order to protect themselves You're expendable, but they want to protect themselves.
Do you have an opinion of what they might do to, cause this oil influx that's going on to decline?
Well, the environmental movement is at the heart of our high energy prices right now. I mean, the whole ethanol mandate, at least originally, I don't know about now, but it added like a whole $1 to the gasoline, whole $1 to the gallon. And then you're burning corn, you're burning food inside of cars. You think about that. Okay, and of course the poor people of the world, that's what they live on is corn. And so the corn prices go up. So food prices go up when the gas prices go up. And they want high gas prices because they want to bring in renewable energy like windmills and solar, because those things are very expensive. They want you to get used to high gas prices so that they can now slowly convert over to this other stuff.
Yeah, but I'm talking about oil drilling, like fracking, supposedly causing
it's causing it's causing the prices to fall because now they're finding so much oil.
But do you have an opinion as to what they're going to do to stop fracking?
It's very interesting. North Dakota and Texas are one of the two states that don't have much federal land, hardly any. That's why fracking is taking off in North Dakota and Texas. Now, in most of the West, there's nothing but environmental control of all that land because it's under federal control. But they can't do anything with North Dakota and Texas because it's all privately owned.
Right. 99% of Texas is privately owned.
North Dakota is too.
Back to the Republic of Texas, I've read. And, for example, California is 55% government owned, and
they're extremely high. The entire West.
Nevada's 87%.
This was a tremendous presentation. It really opened my eyes. A question came to my mind as you were speaking about environmentalism and where it's headed. My question to you is, in light of the recent situation in Ferguson, where it appeared that the news, even from the president on down, the focus became on damaging property, totally overlooking the issue of human lives being taken. My question is, do you see that as a direct connection with this environmentalist mentality where human life is secondary to that of the environment?
Yeah, no, there's no question that it's so psyched into our thinking, taught so many times that people don't, that life has become very cheap today. And so there's no question in my mind that would be a part of that whole discussion. Environmentalism has cheapened life. So you're more expendable than you've ever been in America the last 20 years. You're becoming more expendable as time goes on. You're just a problem. You're burning too much gas, and it's bad. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So it seems to me the essential error that occurs is people are taught to believe that they're here for the earth, whereas the scripture is very clear. The earth is here for us. Okay, God has created it as a temporary home for us, and when the need for that temporary home is done, it'll be destroyed. Okay, we don't have to look to have sustainability of our energy resources and our climate for billions of years. Okay, this is a temporary situation. Okay, God has provided it in order to provide for our needs, provide an environment for us for here and now. And while we have a duty to treat that as a good steward should and not waste it, it's here for us. Okay? All those energy reserves that God has concentrated into the earth, which are, by the way, much cheaper to get at than anything we collect ourselves, like wind or solar, and always will be. Those things are God's provision for us, and those who want to switch over to so-called green energy resources forget or simply don't care that energy cost is the main thing that causes human suffering in the world. In the poor part of the world, high-priced energy is what causes them to starve. Okay, and so high-priced energy is one of the major causes of hunger in the world.
Yeah.
But again, keeping in mind, we're here. It's not here for us.
Yeah.
Well, it is here for us. Excuse me.
Yeah, no, but they attack everything you just said. They would attack. I read that. I read that in back in the 1980s.
But we have a perspective from what God's Word said as our primary truth.
Yeah,
and that's why they disagree with us. If I thought the world, that it was up to me to maintain the climate of the world for the next billion years, I'd be worried too. But I know from God's Word that He's going to sustain it as long as it need be sustained.
Yeah, that's one of the things that they say that Christians lead to the destruction of the planet, because we say this planet's only temporary, therefore you don't have to take care of it. That's one of they really criticize that heavily, that viewpoint you just gave. Well, I agree with you.
Yeah, I want to just ask you, with the allowing of the Ebola into the United States, the undocumented people bringing diseases up through Mexico, and also the thing you brought up about creating crises, how do you feel that that's all tied in with the grand plan of depopulation?
Well, I have no idea. I have no evidence. I may be suspicious, but I can't tie it in. I do have quotes from a couple of pretty important people that would like to become like a virus and kill people. I do have that, but I can't tie in directly Ebola with what we may see going on. But yeah, we live in serious times with a lot of evil people, and with some power, of course. Not all power, but they have some power. Too much power.
Yeah, I think one of the most eye-opening things that Mark started talking on his previous lecture, as well as to some degree on this lecture, is the fact that Baalism is basically environmentalism. Back in the ancient world, and as another friend of mine has taught, there's two basic approaches to these things: creator-creature distinction, where God is separate and apart from His creation, that leads to special creation. Versus every other worldview is the chain of being, and including evolution and all of this. So evolution, in many ways, philosophically and from a cosmological viewpoint, is nothing more than Baalism, you see. And all of this stuff, it's just dressed up in, more recent terminology and language. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, Baalism, you're sacrificing people for the sake of fertility of nature. And of course you would do that with kids, babies, but then also you would do it physically to yourself. Remember, they would go on these religious rituals and just beat themselves up and cut themselves. And so there's a form of asceticism. You need to punish yourself. Yeah,
and so the further you get away from God, the more you start getting into human sacrifice and all of these kinds of things.
The alternative, what's the alternative to sacrificing nature? Sacrificing you. See, that's the alternative.
Yeah, and our culture, everything from, I'll never forget, back in Austin where I used to live, back in the 80s, there was a guy named Patrick J. Timponi, who used to be on KLBJ radio in the afternoons, and he was a New Ager, and he had a program on one. I used to listen to him all the time. Before that, he was replaced by Rush Limbaugh. But nevertheless, he used to have all of these things like the Tao of the hand and how you could learn to play piano and all of this through some mystical experience. But I had a person on there talking about how you had to eat all your food from your local area, and everything because
local
of the
economy. That's
aligning your chakras with the life force and all of this, and the waves and all that came in. So you had to have a garden.
That's what the Nazis were all involved in the 1930s. That's what they wanted people to be involved in, because they came out of World War I. They lived in the city. And of course, in their minds, the Jews controlled the city, and they started starving in the 1920s because of the capitalistic chaos. Nobody had any farms, no plants, no plots to live on. And so that became a big deal in the 1920s and 30s to counteract that problem. So they called it going back to the land. The city is a place of death.
Yeah, and you said last time their plan was to depopulate Poland.
Yeah, they were going to depopulate. Yeah, I could bring in all kinds of Nazi, but I just don't have time for that. It's just, they were getting rid of people, killing Jews, killing Slavs, and there's too many. They were going to make the entire eastern territories into a green garden paradise for Germans. That's what it was all about.
Yeah, and so you can see how these things fit into the direction that the Antichrist wants the world to go to. And so we're on that track, and that's what we were talking about. in the first hour, how the stage is being set. And then you add to that the removal of the church via the rapture, and there's going to be no resistance to this other than people getting saved during the tribulation again. I can't reach you. Could you come out? So, this is what we're saying, globalism, and our next speaker is going to be very, very good on another aspect of globalism as well.
EPA has been claiming bodies of water, and the farmers aren't able to feed their animals or grow their crops, and they can't afford to sue, to go to court, and so we're losing ground in that area where food is concerned.
Yeah, well, fortunately in Texas, our Attorney General, who's going to be our governor, has sued the federal government how many times? What?
31.
31 times over this kind of stuff. So, a few states are trying to fight it, but
yeah.